The morning sun was barely peeking through the windows of Atlanta International Airport as passengers lined up to board the 6:45 a.m. flight to Washington, D.C. The air was thick with that unique blend of coffee breath, perfume, and the lingering scent of cleaning products that all airports seem to share. Flight attendant Diane Parker stood at the entrance of the Boeing 737, greeting passengers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been with National Airlines for 15 years now. 15 years of the same safety demonstrations, the same drink orders, the same complaints about legroom and overhead bin space. Today was already testing her patience. The flight was running 20 minutes behind schedule, and the gate agent had just informed her they were at full capacity. "Good morning, welcome aboard," she repeated mechanically as another wave of business travelers filed past. Her back ached from yesterday's red-eye, and the new shoes the airline required were pinching her toes something fierce. 3 rows behind her, a baby started wailing. Diane's smile tightened. Just what this morning needed. "Sir, that bag looks a bit large for the overhead compartment," she called out to a man struggling to shove his clearly oversized carry-on into the bin. He ignored her completely. Diane felt her blood pressure tick upward, but kept her professional demeanor. She'd deal with him once everyone was seated. The line of boarding passengers slowed to a crawl as people fumbled with tickets and tried to locate their seats. At this rate, they'd be another 15 minutes delayed. The captain had already made 2 announcements asking everyone to board quickly. That's when Diane noticed her, a black woman in a navy blue pantsuit, standing in the aisle, carefully arranging her laptop bag in the overhead bin. The woman was taking her time, making sure nothing would shift during the flight. "We need to get seated quickly, ma'am," Diane called out, her voice sharper than she intended. The plane was hot, they were behind schedule, and her patience was wearing dangerously thin. The woman didn't seem to hear her, still adjusting her bag. "Ma'am," Diane said again, louder this time. Several passengers looked up from their phones. "We're delayed. You need to sit down now or check that bag." The woman turned slightly, about to respond, when a businessman behind her sighed loudly and checked his watch. "Some of us have meetings to get to," he muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Something in Diane snapped. 15 years of holding her tongue, of smiling through rudeness, of being treated like a flying waitress instead of a safety professional, all of it came to a head in that moment. She marched forward, reached past the woman, and slapped her hand away from the overhead bin. "I said we need to get moving." The sound of the slap seemed to echo through the suddenly silent cabin. The woman froze, her hand still in midair. Passengers in nearby seats stared in shock. Someone gasped. A teenage girl in the window seat already had her phone out, recording. The woman slowly turned to face Diane fully. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. Her expression was calm, controlled, and somehow more terrifying than if she'd been screaming. "Did you just put your hands on me?" she asked, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of steel that made Diane's stomach drop. A man across the aisle stood up. "I saw that. She didn't do anything wrong." Another passenger chimed in. "I'm calling customer service right now." Diane felt the situation spiraling out of control. I apologize, but we're very delayed and—" "No," the woman cut her off. "That's not good enough. I'd like your name, and I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, holding it out. "And I think you should know exactly who you just put your hands on." Diane took the card automatically. As she read the name and title, all the blood drained from her face. The business card trembled in Diane's hand as she read the name. Dr. Vanessa Wilson, Executive Director of the National Civil Rights Coalition. Underneath were more titles that made Diane's heart sink further. Former federal prosecutor, member of the Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Aviation Consumer Protection. Of all the passengers on this packed flight to D.C., she had slapped the hand of one of the country's most respected civil rights advocates. Diane's mouth went dry. "Dr. Wilson, I don't know what to say." "I think you've said enough with your actions," Dr. Wilson replied, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't shouting, which somehow made it worse. By now, at least 5 passengers had their phones out, recording everything. The businessman who had complained earlier suddenly found great interest in his shoes, no longer in such a hurry. A gray-haired woman across the aisle spoke up. I've been flying national for 20 years, and I've never seen such unprofessional behavior from staff. This wouldn't have happened if she was white, someone else muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The accusation hung in the air. Diane wanted to protest, to say that wasn't true, that she was just stressed about the delay. But even as the defense formed in her mind, a small voice inside questioned whether she would have reacted the same way to an older white man in a business suit. "I'd like your employee number," Dr. Wilson continued, reaching for her own phone. "And the name of your direct supervisor." Diane's hands shook as she fumbled with her name badge. 15 years of service, and it might all end because of 5 seconds of lost control. She thought of her mortgage, her son's college tuition payments, the dental work she'd been putting off. "Folks, what's the holdup here?" The deep voice came from behind Diane. Captain Reynolds had emerged from the cockpit, his face showing concern as he took in the scene, the phones recording, the stunned passengers, his veteran flight attendant looking like she might pass out. "Your employee put her hands on me," Dr. Wilson explained, her composure intact despite the situation. "She slapped my hand away from the overhead bin while I was arranging my laptop bag." The captain's eyebrows shot up. "Is this true, Diane?" The question hung in the air. Diane could feel sweat beading on her forehead. She could lie, but there were too many witnesses, too many recordings. The truth would come out. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I lost my temper. The delay and..." Her excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. Captain Reynolds took a deep breath, his face grim. "Diane, I need you to deplane immediately." "Tom, please," she started, using his first name despite company protocol. "This isn't a request," he cut her off, then turned to Dr. Wilson. "Ma'am, on behalf of National Airlines, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I assure you it will be addressed with the seriousness it deserves." A flight attendant from first class appeared beside them, summoned by the captain. "Diane, grab your things," she whispered. "I'll cover your position." As Diane gathered her purse from the crew area, she could hear the whispers spreading through the cabin. 15 years of perfect service records, of going above and beyond, of missing her son's baseball games and school plays, all potentially erased by one moment of poor judgment. Dr. Wilson watched her with an unreadable expression. She wasn't gloating or making a scene. Instead, she seemed to be studying Diane with something between disappointment and curiosity. "This isn't over," Dr. Wilson said quietly as Diane passed by her on the way to the exit. "This is about more than just me or you." As Diane stepped off the plane, her cheeks burning with shame, she could already imagine the viral videos being uploaded, the social media outrage building, the inevitable HR meetings. But worse than all that was the knowledge that Dr. Wilson was right. This was about something much bigger than one stressed flight attendant and one wronged passenger. It was about who gets the benefit of the doubt in America and who doesn't. Diane sat alone in a sterile office at Atlanta International Airport, staring at the gray walls. Through the thin window, she could see planes taking off into the clear blue sky, planes she might never work on again. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, family, co-workers, all sending messages asking what happened. News traveled fast in the airline world. She hadn't answered any of them. What could she possibly say? "I slapped a passenger who turned out to be a civil rights leader, and now my career is probably over." A soft knock on the door made her jump. Barbara Chen, the regional manager from National Airlines, walked in with a tablet in her hand. Her face gave nothing away. "The videos are already online," Barbara said without preamble, turning the tablet so Diane could see. The screen showed a social media page where a clip of the incident had already gathered over 50,000 views in just 90 minutes. The comments section was a battlefield. "I messed up," Diane whispered. "I know I messed up." Barbara set the tablet down and took the seat across from Diane. 15 years, Diane. 15 years without a single complaint. What happened up there? Diane rubbed her eyes, which burned from holding back tears. "I don't know. The delay, the pressure, that passenger taking so long. I just snapped." "You put your hands on a passenger," Barbara stated flatly, "and not just any passenger." "I didn't know who she was when it happened," Diane said, immediately regretting her words. As if that made it better somehow. Barbara leaned forward. Would it have mattered? Should it matter? The question hung in the air between them. They both knew the answer. Meanwhile, aboard the now airborne flight to Washington, Dr. Wilson sat quietly in her window seat, watching the clouds drift by. The empty middle seat beside her felt like a buffer zone the other passengers had created. Some stared. Others pretended not to notice her. A few had already tried to engage her in conversation about the incident. The flight attendant who had replaced Diane, a kind-faced woman named Putty, approached carefully. "Dr. Wilson, the captain asked if you'd like to move to first class. We have a seat available." Dr. Wilson shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm comfortable here. Is there anything I can get you? A drink, perhaps? On the house, of course." "Just some water would be fine," Dr. Wilson replied with a small smile. She understood this dance, the airline scrambling to make amends to contain the damage. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop since takeoff. Text messages from colleagues who had already seen the videos. Calls from news outlets wanting statements. Emails from her staff at the coalition alerting her that the story was spreading. Dr. Wilson had spent her entire career fighting for equality and justice. She'd faced down hostile judges, argued before the Supreme Court, stared down CEOs of major corporations. But this, being slapped by a flight attendant simply for taking her time with her bag, hit differently. It was so ordinary, so everyday. And that was precisely why it mattered. The young woman sitting across the aisle leaned over. "Excuse me," she whispered. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry that happened to you. I got it all on video if you need it for anything." "Thank you," Dr. Wilson replied. "I may need to contact you later, if that's all right." Back in Atlanta, Barbara was showing Diane more videos from different angles. In one particularly damning clip, you could clearly see Diane's hand making contact with Dr. Wilson's arm. The slap wasn't hard, but it was unmistakable. "I'm on administrative leave, aren't I?" Diane asked, already knowing the answer. Barbara nodded. "Effective immediately, pending investigation." And Diane, "It doesn't look good." Diane's throat tightened. "Will I lose my job?" "That's not my decision to make," Barbara replied, but her eyes told a different story. "There's going to be a meeting tomorrow with HR, legal, and executives from headquarters. Dr. Wilson's office has already contacted our CEO directly." Diane felt the room spin slightly. The CEO. This was bigger than she'd imagined. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice small. Barbara stood up. "Go home. Don't talk to the press. Don't post anything online. And Diane?" She paused at the door. "You might want to consider reaching out to Dr. Wilson directly. An apology won't fix this, but it's a start." As Barbara left, Diane sat alone again, wondering how a single moment could upend 15 years of hard work, and how she would face her teenage son when she got home. Diane's key barely made it into the lock of her front door. Her hands were shaking so badly. Inside, she found her 16-year-old son, Louis, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Mom? Why are you home so early? When'd you flying to DC today?" The concern in his voice nearly broke her. Diane dropped her flight bag by the door and sank into a chair across from him. "Something happened at work," she said quietly. Before she could explain further, Louis turned his laptop around to face her. On the screen was a news website with the headline, "National Airlines Flight Attendant Removed After Physically Confronting Black Female Passenger." "Mom," Louis whispered, "is this about you?" Diane stared at the screen, at the blurry still image taken from someone's phone video. Even with the poor quality, there was no mistaking her uniform, her posture, her hand reaching out. She nodded, unable to speak. "But that's not like you," Louis said, confusion clear in his voice. "You've always taught me to be respectful to everyone." His words hit her like a physical blow. It was true. She had raised Louis as a single mother after his father died when he was just 4. She had always emphasized kindness, patience, respect. What example had she set now? "I know," she finally managed. "I made a terrible mistake. I lost my temper." Louis was quiet for a moment. "The comments are pretty bad," he admitted, scrolling down the page. "They're calling you racist." Diane flinched. "I'm not." She started to protest, then stopped herself. Wasn't that exactly what a racist would say? That they weren't racist. She had never thought of herself that way. She had friends of all backgrounds. Louise's best friend was black. But then why had she reacted that way to Dr. Wilson? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Is this Diane Parker?" A man's voice asked. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I'm Randy Nichols with Channel 7 News. We'd like to get your side of the story about today's incident." Diane hung up. Within seconds, the phone rang again. Another news outlet. She turned off her phone entirely. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Wilson was being greeted at Reagan National Airport by two members of her staff who had rushed over when they heard what happened. Cameras flashed as she walked through the terminal. "Dr. Wilson, can we get a statement about the incident on your flight today?" A reporter called out. Dr. Wilson paused, considering. As a civil rights leader, she was used to being in the spotlight, but this was different. This was personal. "What happened today was unfortunate," she said carefully. "But it's not about me as an individual. It's about a larger pattern of how black people, particularly black women, are often treated with suspicion and aggression in everyday situations." "Will you be pressing charges against the flight attendant?" Another reporter shouted. Dr. Wilson shook her head. "My interest isn't in punishing one person, it's in creating meaningful change. I'll be meeting with National Airlines executives tomorrow to discuss their training procedures and company policies." As Dr. Wilson and her team left the airport, her assistant leaned in. "The video has over 2 million views already. People are outraged on your behalf." Dr. Wilson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Outrage is easy. Change is hard. Let's make sure something good comes from this." Back at Diane's house, she sat with Louise on the couch, both of them silent. The TV was on, but neither was watching. Diane was thinking about her mother, who had cleaned houses for wealthy families her whole life. "Always keep your dignity," she used to tell Diane. "No job is worth losing your self-respect." What would she think now? "What happens next?" Louise finally asked. Diane took a deep breath. "Tomorrow I meet with HR. They'll probably fire me." "Can they do that?" "For one mistake?" "Yes," Diane said simply. "And maybe they should." Louise looked startled. "But what will we do? Your job pays for everything." Diane had been asking herself the same question for hours. Their savings wouldn't last long. The mortgage payment was due next week. "I don't know," she admitted. "But first I need to apologize to Dr. Wilson, not for the airline, not for the publicity, but because it was wrong. I need to earn that." As she said the words, her path forward became a little clearer. Whatever happened next, it had to start with the truth. Morning light filtered through the blinds as Diane stared at her phone. She typed and deleted the same email 5 times. How do you apologize for something that's gone viral? Something that might have exposed a part of yourself you didn't want to see. Louise appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, already dressed for school. "Did you sleep?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from the dark circles under her eyes. Diane shook her head. "The meeting at headquarters is at 10. Her voice sounded strange even to herself. "Want me to stay home with you?" Louis offered, his young face serious beyond his years. "No, honey. Go to school. This is my mess to fix." She tried to smile but couldn't quite manage it. As Louis left, Diane's phone buzzed with a text from Barbara. "Just a heads up, Dr. Wilson will be at the meeting today." Diane's stomach dropped. She'd hoped to face the HR team and executives first, to tell her side before meeting the woman she'd wronged. Now she'd have to face everyone together. Across town, in a sleek hotel suite, Dr. Wilson was also preparing for the meeting. Her assistant, Portia, was reviewing the agenda. "They've set aside 2 hours," Portia said. "Will that be enough time?" Dr. Wilson adjusted her earrings in the mirror. "It depends on whether they're serious about addressing the problem or just trying to contain the PR damage." The video hit 20 million views overnight, Portia noted, scrolling through her phone. People are calling for boycotts of national airlines. Dr. Wilson turned from the mirror with a frown. "That's not what I want." "So what do you want?" Portia asked, genuinely curious. She'd only been working for Dr. Wilson for 8 months. "I want accountability, not vengeance. I want systems that prevent this from happening to others, not just punishment for one person. She picked up a briefcase. And yes, I want that flight attendant to understand why what she did was wrong. At 9:45, Diane walked through the front doors of National Airlines Regional Headquarters. She'd been here many times before, for training, for celebrations, for award ceremonies where she'd been recognized for exceptional service. Today, security made her wait for an escort. A young man from HR eventually appeared. "Ms. Parker? This way, please." He led her to a conference room where 8 people sat around a large table. Diane recognized the CEO, Richard Tanner, who rarely visited the Atlanta office. Barbara was there, along with 2 people from legal, the head of HR, and the vice president of customer experience. And at the far end, looking composed in a deep purple blazer, sat Dr. Wilson. "Ms. Parker, please take a seat," the HR director said, gesturing to an empty chair directly across from Dr. Wilson. Diane sat down, her legs feeling unsteady. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard Tanner spoke first. "Let me begin by saying this is a deeply regrettable situation for everyone involved. But we're here to find a path forward." Dr. Wilson folded her hands on the table. "Before we start, I'd like to address Ms. Parker directly, if that's all right." All eyes turned to her as she looked directly at Diane. "Ms. Parker, do you understand why what happened on that plane matters?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine, probing. Diane had prepared for anger, for legal threats, for demands. She hadn't prepared for this. She began, then stopped. The rehearsed apology she'd practiced all night suddenly felt hollow. "I think I'm starting to," she said honestly. Dr. Wilson nodded, seeming to appreciate the candor. "Good, because this isn't just about a slap or a moment of rudeness. It's about the fact that many black people, especially black women, go through life being treated with suspicion, being seen as difficult for doing exactly what others do without comment." The room was completely silent. Even the executives, who normally controlled every meeting, seemed to understand this wasn't their moment to speak. "I don't think you're a bad person, Ms. Parker," Dr. Wilson continued. "But I do think you acted on assumptions you might not even realize you hold, and that's what we need to talk about today." Diane felt tears threatening but fought them back. She'd cried enough last night. Today wasn't about her feelings. "I'm ready to listen," she said simply. And for the first time since the incident, she felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't quite over yet. For 3 hours they talked, really talked. Not the corporate doublespeak Diane had expected, not the legal jargon the company lawyers kept trying to insert, but honest conversation about what had happened on that plane and why. Dr. Wilson commanded the room without raising her voice once. When the CEO tried to offer her a private settlement, she firmly steered the conversation back to policy changes. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want your commitment to making sure this doesn't happen again." The head of HR, a thin woman named Gloria, slid a document across the table. "We've drafted a new training program for all customer-facing staff." Dr. Wilson glanced at it, then looked up with a steady gaze. "And who will be designing this training?" The question hung in the air. Gloria shifted uncomfortably. "Our internal team has." "That's not good enough," Dr. Wilson interrupted gently. "You need outside perspectives from people who understand these issues deeply. My organization can recommend several excellent consultants." Richard Tanner nodded, suddenly looking every bit his 65 years. "We'll take those recommendations." Throughout the meeting, Diane had remained mostly silent, listening intently. Now Dr. Wilson turned to her directly. "Ms. Parker, you haven't said much. What are you thinking?" All eyes turned to Diane. She took a deep breath. "I've been with this airline for 15 years, she began. "I've gone through a lot of training. Customer service, safety, emergency procedures, but we never really talked about bias. Not in a real way." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When I reached out and slapped your hand, I wasn't thinking about you as a black woman. At least I didn't think I was. But maybe somewhere inside, I felt more comfortable doing that because of who you are." The room was silent. Even the lawyers had stopped typing notes. "That's hard to admit," Diane continued. "It makes me feel awful. But I think it's true, and I think we need to talk about it." Dr. Wilson's expression softened slightly. That kind of honesty is where change begins. Barbara spoke up. So what happens now? With Diane's position, I mean. It was the question everyone had been avoiding. Diane felt her heart pounding as she waited for the verdict. Richard Tanner cleared his throat. Company policy is clear about physical contact with passengers. There needs to be consequences. Diane nodded, bracing herself for the inevitable. However, Dr. Wilson interjected, I believe in restorative justice, not just punishment. Firing Ms. Parker might satisfy public outrage, but would it create meaningful change? The executives exchanged glances. What are you suggesting? The head of legal asked cautiously. A suspension, certainly, Dr. Wilson replied. But I'd like to see Ms. Parker involved in developing and implementing the new training. Her perspective as someone who's been through this experience could be valuable. Diane stared at Dr. Wilson in disbelief. After everything that had happened, this woman was advocating for her. You would want that? Diane asked. Dr. Wilson nodded. The easy path would be to fire you and issue a press release about zero tolerance. The harder path, the more meaningful one, is to use this as a catalyst for real change. Richard Tanner was already nodding. 3 months suspension without pay, then reassignment to the training development team on probationary status. Diane felt tears threatening again, but this time from relief and something else. A sense of purpose she hadn't expected to find in this room. I accept those terms, she said quietly. As the meeting wrapped up, people gathered their papers and laptops. Diane hesitated, then approached Dr. Wilson, who was speaking with her assistant. Dr. Wilson, she began awkwardly. I just wanted to say thank you. Not for saving my job, although I'm grateful for that too, but for making me see things I needed to see. Dr. Wilson studied her for a moment, then offered her hand. Diane took it, the simple handshake feeling like the beginning of something important. We all have blind spots, Ms. Parker, Dr. Wilson said. The question is what we do once they're pointed out to us. As they walked out of the building together, Diane realized this wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. 6 months later, Diane stood nervously at the front of a training room filled with 30 flight attendants. Some were new hires with fresh faces and eager smiles. Others were veterans like herself, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Most of you probably recognize me, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm the flight attendant from that video. A murmur rippled through the room. Of course they knew who she was. The incident had become a case study in airline training programs across the country. 6 months ago, I thought my career was over. I thought my life as I knew it was over, Diane continued. And in some ways it was, but not in the way I expected. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of her and Dr. Wilson standing together at a podium. This is Dr. Vanessa Wilson, the woman I wronged that day on the plane. The woman who could have demanded my firing, who could have sued the airline, who could have vilified me in the press. Diane paused. Instead, she challenged me to become part of the solution. The door at the back of the room opened, and Dr. Wilson herself walked in. Several attendants straightened in their seats, recognition dawning on their faces. Dr. Wilson has graciously agreed to join us today, Diane said, smiling at her now familiar colleague. Because what we've created together is something special. Over the past months, Diane had worked alongside Dr. Wilson and a team of experts to develop what was now called the Wilson-Parker Protocol, a comprehensive training program that addressed unconscious bias, de-escalation techniques, and cultural sensitivity in high-stress situations. The easy thing would have been to fire me and issue a press release, Diane told the room. The harder thing, the better thing, was to use what happened as a catalyst for real change. Dr. Wilson joined her at the front of the room. When I got on that plane 6 months ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But sometimes the most difficult moments lead to unexpected partnerships. Together, they led the group through scenarios, discussions, and exercises designed to help the attendants recognize their own potential biases and respond more thoughtfully in tense situations. During a coffee break, Louis popped his head into the training room. He'd grown an inch taller in the past 6 months and was sporting a new haircut. Diane waved him in. Dr. Wilson, this is my son Louis. Lewis extended his hand somewhat shyly. "It's nice to finally meet you. My mom talks about you all the time." Dr. Wilson smiled warmly. "All good things, I hope." "Mostly how you saved her job," Lewis said with teenage bluntness. Dr. Wilson shook her head. "Your mom saved her own job by having the courage to face uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of change." After the training session ended, Diane and Dr. Wilson walked together toward the parking garage. Their relationship had evolved from that tense first meeting into something neither could have predicted, not quite friendship, but a partnership built on mutual respect. "The airline wants to expand the program nationally," Dr. Wilson said. "They're getting requests from other carriers too." Diane shook her head in disbelief. "I never thought my biggest mistake would lead to my most meaningful work." Dr. Wilson stopped walking and turned to face her. "That's often how it goes. Our worst moments can define us, or they can refine us. It's up to us to decide which." As they reached their cars, Diane thought about the journey of the past 6 months. Her suspension had been difficult financially, and some of her former colleagues still kept their distance. But others had reached out, sharing their own stories of moments they weren't proud of, asking how they could do better. "You know," Diane said as they prepared to part ways, "when we first met, I thought you were going to destroy my life." Dr. Wilson smiled. "And instead, you helped me rebuild it, just with a better foundation this time." As Diane drove home to Lewis, she reflected on how a single terrible moment had led to months of growth, uncomfortable conversations, and ultimately, transformation. The old Diane had died that day on the plane, but in her place was someone more aware, more compassionate, and oddly enough, more whole.